We are no strangers to the Airbnb phenomenon and how it has revolutionized the travel industry. Over the last 2 episodes, we have been focusing on the rental housing markets in Kenya and India. And today, we'll pan over to Australia to see what the short-term rental market looks like. With the support of the Graham Foundation for Advanced Studies in the Fine Arts, we speak to economic and urban geographer Dr. Thomas Sigler on how the sharing economy and short-term rentals have evolved in Australia and what impact they have on the larger housing market. I am Vaissnavi Shukl and this is Architecture Off Center, a podcast where we highlight contemporary discourses that shape the built environment but do not occupy the center stage in our daily lives. We speak to radical designers, thinkers, and changemakers who are deeply engaged in redefining the way we live and interact with the world around us. Since we're talking about all things short-term rental today, I thought we'll start with just talking about the evolution of the sharing economy and a little bit of a brief history of short-term rentals in Australia. And when we spoke for the first time, you mentioned a little bit about how technology played a role in developing the whole access to short-term rentals, both from the user side and the provider side. So all in all, short-term rentals, technology, and the sharing economy.
Yeah, so the sharing economy was an outgrowth of a number of different processes. One, which you mentioned, was this digital revolution. It transformed a bunch of systems that were already in place as what we might think of as P2P or peer-to-peer systems into digital systems. And this was true across the board. So there are peer-to-peer systems for sharing or for dividing resources in terms of clothing, transportation, accommodation, assets and goods. There's lots of different things that became appified with the digital transformations that occurred about 20 years ago. The biggest sort of catalyst for all of this was the development of the smartphone. So the smartphone essentially just accelerated what was already in place with simple mobile telephones, and it allowed for things to be appified very quickly. So existing systems emerged, and lots of different sharing economy providers, both small and large, emerged from about 2007, 2008 onward. We saw really exponential growth in the sharing economy in the early 2010s. And that's tapered a little bit more recently as what we might refer to as mega providers like Airbnb and Uber have taken over significant market share in a much more commodified way. So the advent of Airbnb and other short-term rental platforms and modes, I should say, not just platforms, was really an outgrowth of the sharing economy. And the sharing economy was really exciting. I think in the first few days, it was really characterized by a lot of innovation and new ideas. And it was also badged as something that could promote sustainability, in that if you had an asset that was lying dormant, for example, a vacation house, you could allow other people to use it for certain parts of the year, and then it would be better utilized. The original idea for Uber was very similar, that people could give rides with excess capacity in their vehicles. For example, if you commute from A to B every morning and someone else in your community needs to go, you could share that. But again, over time, I'd say especially from about 2013, 2014 onward, as larger pools of capital started investing in the sharing economy, many of these platforms got quite large and they started running much leaner, much more commercialized models.
And let's focus a little bit on Airbnb as a typical placeholder for short-term rentals and on the platforms that kind of aid that kind of property sharing or property lending. So how do you think Airbnb has transformed the concept of shared economy beyond just housing? So I'll focus a little bit on housing because the Airbnb model is significantly different from other short-term rentals that exist in the market usually. So if you were to go live in a city and rent an apartment for a summer, would be different than getting an Airbnb. How do you think this technology and this brand of short-term rental, whether it's vacation, whether it's for business, leisure, whatever the cause may be, has changed how housing rental works otherwise. And from there, I also wanted to talk about how this has led to a certain professionalization of this short-term rental, and how do you see it developing in Australia? How has it happened? How do you see it happening?
Yeah, so Airbnb has, and related platforms. When I say Airbnb, I'm sort of using
Yeah.
shorthand for a bundle of providers. Airbnb has really transformed housing markets in particular in several ways. The first of all is just the appification, the digitization of the process. You'll find increasingly there's pressure on the real estate industry, property managers, landlords. There's a whole suite of actors involved in the conventional rental market. And I wouldn't say that they don't need to exist, but I would say particular tasks can be automated and replaced by digital platforms and technology. And that was very slow to change. A lot of these processes, like property management, are big sectors. They're very lucrative. But Airbnb changed all of that. So all of a sudden, people realize the potential of a digital platform where everything from a bond or escrow payments could be held to issues could be resolved. They can be centrally managed. A lot of information can be disseminated very quickly in both directions. And the app could take more of a third-party role and a transactional role, and the host or the property manager and the owner would interact with the tenant or the guest in I guess new and simpler ways. It also opened up some possibilities for short-term rentals. And I've observed over the years that this is really just filling an existing market gap. So what I usually say is that we're really good at long-term rentals. So there's a lot of rules and a lot of possibilities for leases of 6 to 12 months and longer. And in many contexts, it's not uncommon to have a lease of 5 years. In Australia in particular, most people get 6 to 12-month leases. And we're really good at deploying hotel rooms. So there's a whole system established and lots of rules and lots of regulations and possibilities for people wanting to stay at a property for 1 to 3 nights, which is typically a hotel. Anything that falls in the middle of that was a bit of a gray area. And that's where Airbnb picked up the slack. So it's not that they were necessarily trying to wrestle properties away from long-term rentals or hotels. It's that there is genuinely a cohort of people that need accommodation for between 2 and 180 nights that really had nowhere to turn. Oftentimes, these people were visiting for really diverse reasons. So they could have been temporarily working, they could have been visiting family, or they could just be holidaying. But they also have different requirements. So for example, families require extra bedrooms. Oftentimes people want to cut costs in restaurants by cooking. People want to do laundry if they're on an extended trip. So the characteristics of a short-term rental are actually, in many cases, quite different. And we've seen that in the data in different contexts. There's also a lot of variation by geography. There's variation by type in terms of some markets being primarily hosted markets and other markets being primarily unhosted markets.
If you were to do a little bit of a thought exercise in just seeing what the future would look like if the existing market that accommodates for the 6 to 12 month lease, were they ever interested in getting into short-term rentals? So you have condominium developers, you have apartment buildings, landlords who usually do long-term leases. You go through the process of documentation, you have your security deposits held, and then just to think out loud, if they were interested in getting into the short-term rental market in a platform that's not Airbnb, do you think that's a possibility, or do you think we've now reached that stage in shelter speaking broadly, where platforms like Airbnb have monopolized it so much so that now in traditional ways of leasing and renting, short term kind of becomes a little bit of a hassle? Would you say that, or do you think there's still possibility that we can find alternate modes of leasing which are not dependent on platforms like booking.com or others?
Yeah, I mean, you're already seeing this to a great extent with modes like build to rent. So the build to rent sector is essentially a short-term rental accommodation sector for long-term renters. The US has a significant build to rent sector, which it refers to as multifamily. In the UK and Australia, for example, build to rent is very immature, but it looks a lot like short-term rentals. Leases are flexible. They're not necessarily in increments of 6 or 12 months. And the whole platformized system of collecting rent and signing leases is already percolating through. There's lots of sort of digital landlords, digital leases, all kinds of digital technologies that are just making the process easier. Now, the issue, of course, is consumer protection. So the idea that housing is a public good and that it's the government's responsibility to ensure some level of safety, security, and continuity in that does contradict this idea to some degree. The idea being that there's a reason leases are conventionally 6 to 12 months, which is that the government would like the tenant to have a certain amount of certainty that they won't be displaced or evicted if the landlord wants to sell or pursue a higher rent payment from another tenant or just doesn't like the tenant for whatever reason. So I think there's a balance to be struck. It'll look different in every jurisdiction because the delegation of responsibilities between the private sector and government looks different in every jurisdiction. But to answer your question directly, I do think there's a place for digitization and appification in the long-term rental market. But I don't necessarily think that'll come from Airbnb. The data indicate that Airbnb is they're not losing absolute market share, but I would say they're losing relative market share as new players and new entrants start discovering that there's a fairly robust short-term rental accommodation sector out there. You're seeing third-party apps like Airbnb and Booking.com, which are purely intermediary platforms entering the market, but you're also seeing really large hotel providers and increasingly private equity companies and other financial actors are getting involved because they see dollar signs.
In both those cases, Thomas, whether it's the intermediaries like Booking.com or the hotel providers, or I mean, landlords typically wouldn't be on the same roster. What does it do, the short-term rental model itself, do to the property prices? What does it do to the real estate? Do you think it really depends on whether it's a luxury vacation rental versus a more business-like rental in the middle of a city, or do you think short-term rentals have actually influenced the way property rates are seen fluctuating in cities around?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. It's one I get quite often. We've done some research on this, and in sort of geographical terms, we refer to this as the rent gap. And the rent gap essentially refers to what you could be receiving in some other mode and what you are receiving. And so we've done some research, for example, here in Queensland, Australia, where we found that the rent gap between long-term and short-term rentals does exist, but it's very place-specific. And it tends to be place-specific around areas with high amenity. And the reason is most tourists don't have a car. So most tourists are visiting and they're staying somewhere that's walkable. They're staying somewhere that's near public transportation. So in locally specific areas, for example, near the beach or near a central business district or near a transit hub, there tends to be a much higher price on short-term rentals than long-term rentals. The exact opposite is true in the outer suburbs. Because tourists or visitors often don't have a vehicle and they're often unfamiliar with the region, they're often not willing to pay a premium. And the other thing to keep in mind is that this is a dynamic market. Both long-term rental and short-term rental prices are continuously fluctuating. And oftentimes one overtakes the other depending on market conditions. And so actually what you've seen in the last 6 months is a softening of short-term conditions and a hardening of long-term conditions. And in some of our research, we've observed quite a few properties that have come off the short-term market onto the long-term market. To answer your question directly, I've seen research indicating that short-term markets push the price of housing up between about 1% and 3%. And that's in a conventional market. It's a little bit exaggerated in Southern Europe because the difference that Northern Europeans are willing to pay is quite distinct to what you can charge in Southern Europe for local markets. So examples being Venice, Lisbon, Florence. A lot of those markets tend to have quite exaggerated prices between what they're able to charge tourists and what they're able to charge locals. But in an environment where most of your visitors are actually domestic visitors, like Australia, and most of your tenants are domestic tenants, or by definition, I guess all, there isn't terribly large rent gap.
What can be said about the occupancy between the different modes?
Yeah, it really varies. So the main determinant of occupancy is is type or location. So we find that certain properties are very seasonal, particularly in holiday areas. So here in Australia, you have 4 school holidays a year. You have a long school holiday in the summer, and then in each of the 3 other seasons, you've got a 2-week school holiday. And so we find that it's very spiky around those school holidays. That, for example, here in Queensland, we've got the Gold Coast, which is quite a popular tourist destination. And you find the Gold Coast is extremely busy in July, in September, around Easter, and around Christmas. But then you find other times of year, for example, October and May, occupancy might be at 20 or 30% for the average property. So it's highly varied. You'll find occupancies tend to be higher in major cities because there's a more steady flow of visitors year round. Of course, that does vary. Certain cities are much busier in the summer. Other cities are in warm areas. For example, in Australia, we have Darwin. Darwin is actually much more popular in the winter because it's relatively cooler, whereas it's blazing hot in the summer. So overall, you're seeing occupancies intensifying. I think hosts, because of rising interest rates, are a little bit more money conscious than they were 5, 10 years ago and trying to squeeze more out. And given that you've seen more professionalization, professional hosts and professional property managers are perhaps have greater attention to the market, a little bit more of a pulse in terms of what they can charge. And the occupancy rates tend to be higher in professionally managed properties.
While talking about all of this, like the business aspect of it and seeing how people are paying to get an accommodation, whether it's a hotel or it's an Airbnb. I was 21 living in Europe as an exchange student, and I went backpacking. And I don't know if it still exists. There used to be a platform called Couchsurfing, which had a little bit of a social angle towards it's not rental, it's literally like finding a place and crashing at somebody's place, but that the social angle made it so interesting where you could go to a different city, you could stay with a local person, pretty much like Airbnb maybe, but you just don't pay for it. Like you just go and you crash on somebody's couch. I don't know if the social angle is something that comes into play. I mean, some Airbnbs, of course, will have a host who'll go out of their way and do blah blah blah, but that I thought was a very interesting model because you didn't have to pay for it. There was just a platform where people could put their couches, number of people they could host, you could write to them, and it was actually a lot of fun because they would be showing you around to places that you would typically have not explored as a young student. And we were in Berlin, we crashed in this area called Kreuzberg with a couple who was an artist, and they took us to this random local festival. And those are the kind of things I don't know if they would ever become a part of an experience. Now, of course, Airbnb and booking.com, you can actually book experiences with different hosts, and you have super hosts to do this and that. But I just thought that was a very interesting model where just the financial side was completely taken out of it, and you were just banking on the social aspect of it.
Yeah, so Airbnb is a direct outgrowth of couchsurfing. The original concept was 3 guys and a mattress in San Francisco, and it was during the, I think, Democratic National Convention. There was a lot of people in town looking for rooms, and so they rented out essentially a spare mattress on the floor. And that was the beginning of Airbnb, which was pretty much the couchsurfing model, except monetized. To be fair, you do have lots of sharing economy platforms that are non-monetized. You've got lots, especially things like food sharing, clothing. I think they really speak to
What do you
Gen
mean when you
Y.
say food sharing? Sorry.
Yeah, so for example, if a restaurant overproduces food for an event, they might be able to put that up. Hey, we have 100 additional bread rolls. If you're running event, let's say a children's soccer event, and you're looking for some surplus food, you can come and get it from us for free.
Okay.
So just allowing people to access surplus or garden vegetables, for example. If you have a garden that has vegetables you can't consume, you could offer the community to come over and harvest those for you, and then they would get to take some home. So lots of sort of goodwill initiatives. Clothing is a big one. So both monetized and non-monetized, really speaking to the sustainability preferences of Gen Y and Gen Z. We're so used to fast fashion with, for example, Zara and H&M. You might buy a shirt and wear it twice. And then it's a perfectly good shirt, but you've already gotten 2 Instagram photos in it. And then you might just say, hey, anyone who wants this can have it for the price of postage.
Yeah. Um, uh, Knowing that, there's so many different aspects to any kind of sharing, I was wondering if you could shed a little bit of light on what COVID did to the short-term rental market. Obviously, people were not traveling. Travel was at a full stop. People suffered a lot of losses. What was it like in Australia during the pandemic, and what was
Yeah,
the
I mean,
recovery like?
I can really only speak to Australia on this one, but our borders were totally shut for almost 2 years, which means that there was zero international visitation. This had a particularly challenging impact on Sydney. Sydney is the sort of gateway for international visitation, and on certain areas that really appealed to international visitors, like the Whitsunday Islands or Cairns or Melbourne to a lesser extent. So what happened is a lot of those properties either sat vacant, they were sold because there was rising property prices, or they were converted back to long-term rentals. In the 2 years since the pandemic has sort of finished, some of those properties have made their way back onto the short-term rental market, but in a much more professionalized form. So I think what the pandemic did, and we've observed this in other sectors we've studied, is that it had an accelerating effect. It didn't necessarily have a transformational effect, but it had an accelerating effect to advance processes that were already in train, specifically the professionalization of property. So we find that, and we can see this in the data, if you look at the number of hosts with more than 2 properties, we consider them professional. We consider them an amateur professional if they have 2 to 3 properties, and then a professional if they have more than 5 properties. That doesn't mean they own them, but it means they manage them. So these properties are managed like hotel rooms. They're provided with the same amenities, clean towels and soap and things like that. And the uses have intensified. And the market's really been shaped here in Australia by the domestic market the last few years. It's been a push to the regions, so that's outside of major cities. There's been a huge amount of Airbnb demand in my state of Queensland for 2 reasons. One, relatively speaking, we were open for business during the pandemic in that our state border was closed, but domestically we were relatively free to travel. And the other reason is Queensland is a resource-based state, and the resources economy of Australia has continued to perform well, and you have a lot of short-term travel relating to that. So people who are working in the mines and working in oil and gas, and you can see that very clearly in the data. The regions that are what you might call non-conventional accommodation markets have done really well.
You alluded a little bit to the city and the areas outside of the city. What does the urban-rural divide, if there is any, look like? And I know you've studied this phenomena of the urban-rural short-term rental markets across the world, and especially between India and Australia. You've noticed some changes in terms of how access to technology actually changes the way properties are offered or properties are sought after. On a global perspective, what's your overall just broad commentary on this difference?
Yeah, there's a lot of distinction between urban and rural properties. Uh, Part of it is that it is policy. So housing is a lot more competitive in cities, and therefore urban policy is a lot more, I would say, anti short-term rental than regional and rural policy. A lot of regional and rural areas in Australia are quite keen to host tourists and recognize that short-term rental is often the only form of accommodation, if not one of the only forms of accommodation, for example, in parts of Tasmania or parts of states that are far away from our major capital cities. You also tend to get many more properties in cities, and therefore I think it's seen as more of a policy issue than perhaps in regional areas. But the main policy spearheads in Australia tend to be areas that are overwhelmingly characterized by the tourism economy. So Byron Bay is a really good one to look at. And then in Queensland, you've got Port Douglas and Noosa, where in each case, something like 10 to 20% of the housing stock is short-term rentals. And I don't think that's a problem as such. The issue is that often essential workers have challenging conditions finding accommodation. And I think finding the right balance there is tough. And again, I'm talking about this in the context of rural versus urban, because in cities, we have lots of housing. So in theory, there is a solution that could be achieved through subsidies or some other form. But in regional areas, there's just not a lot of housing to begin with. And so oftentimes small differences in demand can actually lead to, small differences in supply can lead to exaggerated outcomes in demand.
Something that we've been seeing in India, even right now, is a lot of organizations, whether they are nonprofit organizations or cooperatives or farmer collectives, kind of coming together to enable farm owners or people who run small scale businesses in rural areas to offer up their houses as experiences. So there's a couple of platforms which are just dedicated farm stays in the south and west of India. There are a couple of platforms which have, well, you wouldn't say it's short-term rental, but the duration ranges from 15 days to 3 months. And those are located just in the hills in areas which have snow. So there's a lot of these very niche platforms plotting up where they're identifying properties, property owners, people who are able to, offer experiences and kind of bringing them together. The interesting thing, however, is I don't know if this has to do with just the way they're putting them out, but these properties don't exist on Airbnb for some reason. So they don't exist on booking.com, they don't exist on Airbnb. They're just there as independent platforms where only if you knew about this particular farm stay cooperative in, say, 3-hour radius from Mumbai, you would know about it. And then you go there and they have all sorts of activities. And similarly with the mountain ones. Do you think there are any such alternate platforms, initiatives popping up in Australia? Or do you think because of the access to technology, a lot of people have been able to formalize it and just put it upon Airbnb, platforms like that, and just centralize it rather than offshooting into more independent collectives?
Yeah, look, I think it's important to stress that Australia's always been a tourism economy. There's always been a lot of tourists, and there's always been a lot of appetite for experiences and accommodation. So none of this is new. A lot of it's been put on digital applications, and a lot of it's been Airbnb-ified. But this is not the first time the tourism economy has shifted, and it's not the last time it will shift. So, I guess the perspective of regional and rural tourism operators, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. If existing word of mouth is enough to supply their business with customers, then I think that's totally fine. I do think it's a matter of preference, though. I find, so for example, with Uber, there were strong pushes against Uber about 10 years ago. And what they realize is young people especially really like the idea of ordering a taxi on their phone. So regardless of the fact that it's cheaper than a conventional taxi, it's the idea that you can order something on your phone and that you don't have to talk to a human being. And I think that's just a Gen Y and Gen Z preference in general. So to answer your question, I do think ultimately a lot of things will be appified slowly but surely.
Last question. You spoke about changes in the tourism industry, how there have been shifts. How do you see it shifting from now on? Do you think there are other modes which will prop up that we don't foresee coming? Or do you think there are different modes that will take a new avatar and just keep on reinventing themselves depending on how tourism and how global movements tend to affect the overall human population across the world?
Yeah, look, I mean, it's a work in progress. I think the one thing that's really matured in the last 2-3 years is the regulation. I think COVID was really a time for a lot of places to pause and think hard about their regulation, because tourism came back with a vengeance after COVID. And so I think the maturation of regulation has really shaped Airbnbs and short-term rental markets around the world in the last couple of years. If I had to predict what's going to happen, I would say that we're going to continue to corporatize the model. My guess is that major players, and this is already happening, Hilton, Marriott, Sheraton, Novotel, all the big hotel players in the world, will see a lot of opportunity in short-term rentals. And my suspicion is that there actually won't be too big a difference between a conventional lease a short-term rental and a hotel stay in 50 years.
Whew. Waiting for the time to come. But until then, Thomas, thank you so much for your time. And we hope to read more of your research and see what you're doing next.
Great. Thank you very much. Thanks for having
Thank
me.
you. Yep. Bye-bye. Special thanks to Ayushi Thakur for the research and design support and Kahan Shah for the background score. You can follow us on Instagram at arcofcenter and reach out to us through our website arcofcenter.com. That is ARCHOFFCENTRE. And thanks for listening.